When Jonathan Nice picks his wife Michelle from a catalog, he thinks he's found his ultimate possession.
He was a wealthy guy. She was a young, beautiful girl. They each had something that the other was looking for.
But money can't satisfy every desire, and a secret affair can cost you.
There's no doubt in my mind that this is one sick individual.
And later, from the day they fell in love, Adele and Stephen Craven had it all planned out.
They wanted to do great things together. They were going to live life to its fullest.
But plans, like hearts, are easily broken, and the damage will be deadly.
The neighbor saw a body at the bottom of the stairs. Blood was everywhere.
Because when it comes to affairs of the heart, 2 is company, 3 is a crowd, and 1 is a killer. Love should never be a chore. But even the healthiest marriage requires plenty of hard work. And if the husband isn't up to the task, some women have been known to seek out the help of a hired hand. Jonathan and Michelle Nice work hard to have a happy home. So it's only natural to want to plant the seeds of friendship. But when dirty secrets are revealed and lovers betrayed, this marriage will wilt on the vine. Jonathan Nice owes everything he has to perseverance. And the good doctor almost has everything he wants.
Jonathan Nice was determined to make a name for himself in the medical field. He started a company to market a drug he'd invented to cure asthma. He was really doing new things, and he was getting a lot of respect.
But in 1989, as he nears 40 years old, there is just one thing all his hard work has not yet bestowed: the love of a good woman.
His colleagues never saw him with a girlfriend. He never seemed to have much interest in the opposite sex. He was very kind of aloof in that way.
Far be it for Jonathan to leave his romantic future to fate. He decides to pursue a wife the best way he knows how: through research. After all, for a rich American doctor, there are plenty of fish in the sea, especially in international waters.
There was a friend of his who introduced him to the idea of a pen pal magazine from the Philippines. He saw Michelle's picture and instantly was infatuated with her. Jonathan and Michelle corresponded for about a year. Telephone calls, letters, a lot of letters.
There were passionate letters from Jonathan. He would send Michelle cards saying he loved her with little drawings of hearts and things, so it was very romantic.
And for the 19-year-old Michelle, the affections of a wealthy American is just what the doctor ordered.
Michelle came from a very small town in the Philippines. Her family was poor, and Jonathan represented a life that she really wanted, and that was money and affluence.
After a whirlwind week of romance in the Philippines, Jonathan pops the question: and everyone gets their happily ever after. For now, at least.
Michelle, she's got a man that absolutely adores her, dotes on her, buys her everything she wants, and he has this young woman who knows no one, relies on him, someone who he could control.
Several months later, Michelle arrives in the States, ready to start her new life as Mrs. Jonathan Nice.
She goes to all the social occasions, she improves her English, and she starts getting a taste for the American way of life.
Eventually, she became pregnant, and they really were a family. She loved being a mom. He loved being a dad. I mean, it didn't get much better.
Lucky in life and love, Jonathan's star is burning brighter than ever.
Jonathan's research began to take off. He had gotten about $100 million pumped into his company for his drug. At that point, the sky was the limit. This was going big. It meant for him that he was going to be famous and revered and respected. For Michelle, it meant living a lavish lifestyle.
That's the thing with your first taste of the good life. No one ever wants it to be their last.
They eventually moved to New Jersey for the company, and Jonathan and Michelle end up getting a big house in Hopewell Township.
The house was $800,000 plus. But by the time Michelle was done with it, with the upgrades, it was worth a lot more. She had a fountain installed in the semicircular driveway. Whether he needed it or not didn't matter to him. His wife wanted it. They were full on living the American dream.
6 years and 2 children later, the Nices are sitting pretty in their posh New Jersey suburb. But with her husband burning the midnight oil at work, Michelle often finds herself alone in the empty mansion.
She had everything she wanted except freedom. She had gotten pregnant young, and I think she wanted to enjoy life a little more.
You know what they say, if you love someone, set them free. Well, Jonathan isn't about to take that chance.
Friends noticed that Jonathan seemed a little controlling. She wanted to join the gym, and he wouldn't let her. He wanted her home, so he built her a gym in her house. I mean, she was like a bird in a gilded cage.
By the summer of 2002, like many a lonely housewife before her, Michelle throws her pent-up energy into a little side project.
Michelle wanted a house landscaped. They paid a garden center at $50,000 to plant trees. And the head of the team was a guy called Enya. He was a handsome young guy. Michelle was taken. She liked him.
Ah, you know the best thing about hiring help? The company.
Enya was good looking, in a rugged landscaper sort of way. The absolute opposite of Jonathan. She asked him for his cell phone number, and the two struck up a friendship. He was from another country originally, so she really felt she could be herself with him.
Never mind that Enya comes with a little extra baggage.
He lived in a dumpy little garden apartment with his common-law wife and their child. And he had a bit of a checkered past, but he was a hard worker.
And before long, Michelle learns that landscaping is not Ennio's only talent.
It evolved. Within a couple months, they started to have a sexual relationship that played out in some of the seediest motels up and down the Route 1 corridor. I mean, this was no room service type of liaison. This was rent by the hour, seedy, down and dirty sex.
I think Michelle saw a handsome Latin lover that, was sort of exciting. By that time, Jonathan was too busy with his work and traveling to pay much attention to Michelle, so she would get it elsewhere.
With his late hours on the job, Jonathan has no idea that his caged bird is singing.
You've got a controlling, jealous husband. You've got a wife who is acting out in sexually reckless ways. And you've got a cad, Romeo, thrust in the middle of this. I can't see it ending in any good way.
When it comes to betrayal, ignorance can be such bliss, but the truth can be murder. Jonathan Nice and his wife, Michelle, are living the American dream with their 3 kids in a posh New Jersey suburb. But it turns out this housewife has spent the last several months frequenting a seedier side of town with a handsome gardener named Ennio.
They weren't interested in the ambiance. They wanted a room by the hour. And who cared if the sheets were clean?
By the end of 2002, while Michelle is playing dirty with the gardener, Jonathan's once thriving business is in need of a little maintenance of its own.
A lot of the investment money was drying up. His asthma drug was faltering a bit, and eventually some investors stepped in, and one of their first orders of business was to get rid of Jonathan. It was devastating to him.
And for Michelle, Jonathan's new job as stay-at-home dad puts a bit of a damper on her favorite daytime hobby.
Before, Jonathan was hardly ever at home. Michelle didn't have a problem going to see Ennio, she'd just walk out. Now, Jonathan was in the house the whole time, so things really got bad.
You're gonna get out of that couch. You've been there all day long.
You got everything you want. I supported you on everything.
She felt she was under constant surveillance. So Michelle told Jonathan she was going to night school, taking classes at a local community college to become a certified physical trainer.
About 3 weeks later, there was a call came from the school saying the class had been postponed, it would start next week. And Jonathan said, well, she's already been going for like 2 or 3 weeks. And they said, no, she hasn't. And he starts becoming suspicious.
How soon before Jonathan discovers that his wife's night classes are actually a crash course in anatomy?
What's Jonathan Nice good at? Research. So I think he turned that razor-sharp mind of his to his wife.
He starts looking at Michelle's cell phone records and finds there's a particular number that's being called more than any other. So he goes online, he does a reverse check and finds that the number belongs to Ennio.
Let's just say Jonathan vastly underestimated how much attention the gardener was paying his wife's hedges. And it isn't long before he has the proof.
In July of 2003, Jonathan confronted Michelle. He told her that he had received a phone call from a man who played a tape for him over the phone of Michelle having sex with another man.
Jonathan said he recognized Michelle's voice, and then he's told that unless he provides $500,000, the individual was going to make those tapes public.
And if there's one thing Jonathan holds near and dear, it's his public image.
Eventually, Michelle admitted that she was having an affair with the man that Jonathan himself had hired to plant trees in their yard.
Michelle may have played her cards right when she landed her meal ticket, but it seems someone else might be working from the same playbook.
She told Jonathan that she had broken off the affair because Ennio had become too interested in the family finances, and that he had asked her for money.
You know, a broken heart can make a man do a lot of things, but an empty wallet can make him do much worse.
Police went out and interviewed Ennio, who professed to know nothing of any of this. And he said he never borrowed money from Michelle. He wasn't interested in Michelle's money and had never made any of those phone calls.
There was not a shred of evidence that could tie Ennio to what Jonathan was alleging. So the charge was dismissed as long as Michelle and Ennio agreed not to have any contact.
And just like that, Jonathan has his wife all to himself again.
He was trying to sort of, be the youthful companion that she was looking for.
They're going out to the local clubs. I think he thought Michelle was coming back into the fold and life was going to go on. This was just going to be a hiccup in an otherwise happy fairy tale marriage.
But once the seeds of betrayal are planted, they can be difficult to uproot.
January 16th, 2004, there was a snowstorm overnight, and there were some down power lines, and the utility company was out checking on service. They see an SUV in Jacobs Creek, and one of the guys goes down to check it out, and inside he finds a woman dead, clearly dead. Police go down there, lo and behold, who is it? Michelle Nice.
And to the officers at the scene, this is obviously no ordinary car accident.
There was cuts and bruises all over her body. There was comparatively very minor damage to the SUV, considering the amount of damage to Michelle Nice's head. There were defensive wounds to her hands that, looked like she was fighting back in some way. Just didn't seem to add up. It really didn't.
And Michelle's appearance isn't the only thing about the scene leaving an impression.
We observed footprints leading away from the front passenger door across the creek. It appeared that there was a lot more going on than just a single car accident.
The car is found less than a 5-minute drive from the Nice's house.
We had asked Jonathan, when was the last time that you saw her? And he told us around 4:30 that afternoon. He explained that it seemed like things were really getting better between them. Jonathan was adamant that Ennio had something to do with this, if not directly responsible for it.
When police sit down with Michelle's landscaping lover, they are expecting a stonewall. But the nicest former employee is full of surprises.
He was exceptionally forthcoming. He told us about the fair. He told us when it started, how it started, where it was conducted. He told us what happened the night of the homicide. He was with Michelle.
Sounds like an ultimatum wasn't enough to keep these lovebirds apart.
They mutually agreed that they would have no contact, and they didn't for a short period of time. He said that Michelle reached out to him, they met up, and they started the affair again. They went to the motel, they had sex, and he dropped her off at her car, and she went home. And that was the last time he talked to her or spoke to her.
Love 'em and leave 'em. It's a likely story. But luckily for Ennio, his alibi is airtight.
After he kissed Michelle goodnight, he went to a bar and met up with a buddy where they had a couple of beers.
The bartender remembered Ennio, remembered what he drank, remembered where he sat, and was there during the time that Ennio said he was there.
Ennio may be off the hook for murder, but the same can't be said for Michelle's husband.
At the station, we took a statement from Jonathan. After the statement was concluded, I gave him a ride back home. We were just having a normal conversation, and he just volunteered. I really thought things were gonna work out. We really haven't been arguing that much. The last time we argued was last night. The first thing that ran through my mind was, well, wait a minute. He said the last time you saw her was 4 o'clock. Now you're saying that it was last night.
Sounds like Jonathan is having trouble keeping his story straight. And soon police have all the evidence they need to prove it.
All roads came back to Jonathan. Police conducted the search at Jonathan's house. They found cut-up soles of the shoes that we believe he was wearing that night. Those shoes were reconstructed, and the pattern on the bottom of those shoes were consistent with the pattern that we found in the snow walking away from the vehicle.
There was blood in the garage. There were blood splatters on the wall. There was blood splatters leading up the back stairway.
The evidence against Jonathan Nice is overwhelming. With his scorned husband back in the interview chair, it doesn't take much pressure to make him crack.
Jonathan turned to police and said, I'm ready to talk, but let me ask you one thing first. This is very important. Was Michelle with Ennio the night before? And the detective looks at him and said, Jonathan, yes, she was. And at that point, Jonathan broke down and told the police everything.
Once his wife fell in love with another man, there was nothing he could do to stop it. Well, almost nothing.
About 1 o'clock in the morning, Jonathan heard Michelle drive into the garage. He came down and he confronted her about coming home so late.
The hell have you been?
And she lost her temper with him.
Get out of the car! Get out of my...
He said that she had a stiletto in her hand and that she lunged at him. He said that he assisted her out of the truck, basically throwing her to the ground. She went head first into the cement. He decides the best way to control her is to smack her head into the cement 2 more times.
From the moment he met her, Jonathan controlled every aspect of Michelle's life, even up until the very end.
Police believe he put her behind the wheel and then drove down that steep embankment, down the creek, and in she went. He got out and ran home. What did him in was he didn't have time to clean up the scene.
The incredible story is hard for the police to believe, and in the end, they don't.
I think he was honest when he said he did it, but I still am skeptical that it happened the way he said it did.
With a confession on the record, Jonathan is arrested and charged with first-degree murder in his wife's death. A jury, however, sees things a bit differently than detectives.
The defense had argued all along that it was an accident. They managed to get the jury to consider passion provocation manslaughter, which is murder, but committed in the heat of passion.
Jonathan was sentenced to 7 years for the passion provocation manslaughter and an additional year for the tampering with evidence.
He was released in 2010 after serving 5 years.
Michelle Nice came to America to find a new life. Instead, she found a killer.
You never know. You never know what can happen. You never know what people are capable of. You could look at the same scenario in so many different places and it doesn't end up this way. So if there's the lesson, it's, this could happen anywhere.
Sometimes, no matter how hard you work, you can still come up short. Which is why, on rare occasions, a lady may afford herself the assistance of the sturdier sex. Luckily, there are plenty of men willing to help a woman in her time of need. No one can argue that Steve and Adele Craven aren't hardworking people. But even the most ambitious of folks need a little help from time to time. But when a helping hand gets too friendly in the family home, the damage will be beyond repair. Stephen Craven is the kind of guy who has it all planned out. Work his way through college, get a good job, and settle down with the girl of his dreams. If only it was that easy.
Stephen grew up in Minnesota, but moved to Pasadena, California, and began college out there. He had tremendous ambition. Steve knew he wanted to do great things.
I love a man with an appetite for success. And Stephen certainly is hungry.
He came across the Coast Guard, and it seemed like something that he would like to do. He wanted to be a pilot.
By the 1980s, with Stephen's career taking off, there's no stopping this overachiever. But love finds you when you least expect it.
Welcome aboard. Thanks. Stephen was working in a factory and he needed a trainer, his replacement, before he went to work for the Coast Guard. That replacement was Adele Zacuna. They started dating.
But love in the workplace can be a tricky business.
Stephen and Adele needed to keep their relationship quiet because it was somewhat inappropriate for him to be romantically involved with the girl that he was training.
Soon the secret is out, as both Stephen and Adele admit they are falling for one another hard.
The exotic Adele was probably a little different than the type of girl that Stephen grew up with in Minnesota. And for Adele, here comes this guy, this good-looking, clean-cut, square-jawed pilot for the Coast Guard.
And what girl can resist a man in uniform? In January of 1989, after 4 years of dating, Stephen and Adele tie the knot.
The first few years of Stephen and Adele's marriage were exciting times. He is serving his country, and Adele was studying to get her mortician's license.
They were both very ambitious. They wanted to do great things together. They weren't just going to sit back and let life happen to them. They were going to live life and live life, to its fullest.
Soon, in the summer of 1990, opportunity comes knocking, and the couple leaves their home in sunny California behind.
The Cincinnati airport started expanding quite a bit back in the early 90s, and Stephen had gotten a pilot's job at a large airline. Stephen and Adele chose to settle down in Edgewood, Kentucky, just a few minutes away from the airport.
From the beach to the burbs, for a Midwestern boy like Stephen, it's a little slice of heaven. But Adele isn't exactly on cloud nine.
Adele was not quite ready to have a family just yet. But Stephen wanted children very early, so she was willing to do this for Stephen. But Stephen was adamant that Adele's place was to be at home, to take care of the children.
Some men bring home the bacon, while the wife stays home and fries it up. Well, Adele is not that kind of girl.
Adele wanted her own identity. She wanted her own career, and that put stress on their marriage from the very beginning.
But Adele sets her dreams aside and abides by her husband's wishes.
By the time the Cravens' second son was born, Stephen was pretty settled into his job. He was traveling quite often, very routine, and he was leaving Adele for stretches of time by herself. And it was real difficult on Adele.
It's an age-old dilemma, but it does have an upside. With all that time home alone, Adele has plenty of opportunities to indulge her secret desires.
When a married couple spends time apart, one can be tempted to fill that void with a relationship. Certainly, there's temptation.
Stephen has everything he's always wanted, but Adele finds her life lacking a little something. It isn't until a hunky repairman gets handy in the Craven family home that Adele knows exactly what that something is.
The Cravens got to know Rusty McIntyre because he had done some odd jobs around the house.
Rusty became friends with Stephen and Adele both. So when the Cravens had an unfinished basement, Rusty set about finishing it, doing the drywall, doing the painting, and getting the flooring down.
Rusty was spending more and more time in the house doing home remodeling, and I think Rusty and Adele grew closer and closer together. They were both in unhappy marriages with children and didn't know how to get out of them. They grew very close by sharing their loneliness.
And there's no better cure for loneliness than a little extramarital affection.
Once Rusty and Adele exchanged a hug in the basement, and it meant something more than just a brief hug. When they both realized they were looking for something else, they realized, well, we might be looking for the same thing. So Rusty and Adele began having a sexual relationship.
Talk about going above and beyond to please the client. And it certainly is hard to resist a man who's so good with his tools.
Rusty also gave her a cell phone at the time, and this is back where not everybody was carrying cell phones. And Rusty, having given Adele a cell phone, made Steve very upset. He didn't like that.
Well, who can blame him? If only Stephen knew what dirty little secrets were floating across that phone line.
Steve didn't have any suspicion that she was carrying on a relationship, but he did know that it was just wrong for her to be carrying around Rusty's cell phone all the time. They were calling each other hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times per month.
And the phone bill isn't the only thing getting heavy between these two.
Well,
Stephen would be gone on trips, and this is where neighbors started to notice that Rusty was there more often than during work hours. The truck would be there very late at night. The truck would be there very early in the morning.
And it isn't long before there's plenty of chatter in the cul-de-sac about Adele's hired help.
Rusty and Adele were carrying on their affair pretty much wherever they could. At one point, an Edgewood patrolman caught them in the act of sexual intercourse in the back of Rusty's truck behind the big Catholic church next to their home.
A church parking lot is certainly a convenient place to confess moral indiscretions. But lust is not the only sin Adele's committed lately. Sometimes greed can be just as deadly.
Stephen believed that Adele was spending recklessly, so he gave her enough cash that he believed she needed, and he put her on a budget. So it began to really boil and stew for her.
Really? More clothes?
It's the perfect storm for a troubled marriage. And this storm shows no signs of blowing over.
By the year 2000, the Cravens' marriage was on the rocks. Stephen was increasingly frustrated with Adele and how the money was being spent. Adele increasingly felt that Stephen was being unreasonable. They were difficult times.
But times with Rusty are as happy as ever.
Adele and Rusty were saying to one another that they were going to spend the rest of their lives with each other, that they had found their true soulmate. Even though Rusty and Adele were both married to other persons and had families of their own.
In May of 2000, Adele was considering divorce as an option. So Adele talked to her mother. Her mother wired her $3,000 for a divorce.
Well, divorce can be a tidy way to clean up a messy marriage. Too bad Stephen doesn't share Adele's sentiments.
Stephen was probably suspecting that there was at least something emotional that was going on between Adele and Rusty. I think Stephen really loved her. I think Stephen also really loved his boys and his idea of his family. He loved his family so much that he would have done anything for it.
And if Stephen gets wind of his wife's escapades, something will certainly need to be done about the handyman driving a wedge through his marriage.
Steve was very concerned, very worried about what's going on with his wife and Rusty.
A betrayal like this, I think, would have pushed Steve to the point of no return as far as his marriage goes.
When deceit cuts this deep, someone is bound to get their hands a little dirty. And when all is said and done, someone will end up dead. After a torrid summer fling with Rusty, the hired handyman, Adele Craven has decided that if she is finally going to start a new life, there is no time like the present. And with her husband Stephen suspicious of his wife's new friend, the clock is ticking for Adele.
Rusty and Adele were brazen about this affair because maybe they both had their own agenda. Perhaps for Rusty, this was some type of trophy, something that he could brag about. And for Adele, I think she probably wanted to rub it in Stephen's face.
But for Stephen, breaking up his family is not an option, and neither is sharing his wife with a local handyman. 3 people in one marriage can be a tight squeeze, and someone's about to be pushed out.
On the night of July 12, 2000, Adele pulls into her driveway with her 2 kids in the car after a day of shopping, looks up and sees the front door is wide open. This concerned her because her husband was supposed to be out of town.
Washington County 911. My name is Adele Craven. I live at 10 Road. My front door is open, and can you please just flag her out?
The neighbor went around the back, went into the basement area, looked through the glass door, and saw a body at the bottom of the stairs. Blood was everywhere.
And it was clear that it was a white male. His head had been beaten pretty seriously, and he was shot 3 times in the side of the head. From the family photograph that we were handed, it was clear that was Stephen Craven at the bottom of the stairs.
For Stephen's neighbors and friends, the news is hard to believe.
The word of Stephen Craven's murder spread like wildfire. People were in a state of shock because murders just don't happen in Edgewood. And here we have a father of 2, a retired U.S. Coast Guard member. This was a very big deal.
It's the news every wife dreads. Well, almost every wife.
When I first told Adele that it was indeed Stephen at the bottom of the stairs, there were no tears, there was no yelping or no nothing. It threw me for a loop. I expected to see a woman upset that her husband had been killed.
Adele said she left around 10 o'clock that morning with the boys. She said that Stephen was going to make a quick trip to New York City and that he would be back the next day and that they were getting ready to leave on a family vacation that they had planned. Stephen was alive and well. She kissed him goodbye, and she was planning on seeing him the next day.
Well, nothing like a murder to put a crimp in your weekend plans. To sort things out, police ask neighbors if they have seen anything of note going on with the Cravens lately. Needless to say, the shenanigans going on across the cul-de-sac haven't exactly been discreet.
The fact that Rusty and Adele were having a sexual relationship was very incriminating because immediately both of them have a motive to have Stephen killed.
And an even better motive than lust? Greed. Something tells me Adele had no intentions to live on a handyman's salary.
Adele was complaining to her friends about her marriage all the time. And she was even at a party where she joked that if Stephen's plane crashed, she could collect the $500,000 life insurance policy and live happily ever after with her 2 kids.
Sounds like Adele had a plan much more final than divorce.
Adele had asked a neighbor if he knew where she could hire a hitman to have her husband killed, and that she could pay him about $50,000. And he didn't take her serious and thought it was a bad joke. It just made Adele that much more of a suspect.
A suspect ready to cut and run.
Police looked into the Cravens station wagon and found a purse that had not just Adele's wallet, but Adele's passport. It had a lot of clothing of hers, as well as her children. It looked like Adele was planning on leaving and not coming back.
Well, with all that hard work, scheming, and planning, a girl could use a vacation. But now that police are onto her, Adele isn't going anywhere.
She admitted to her affair with Rusty, but she would take no responsibility for the homicide. But we obviously felt like we had enough to arrest her and to go forward.
With Adele behind bars, police zero in on her most likely accomplice. Too bad for them. Rusty's already skipped town.
Shortly after the murder, Rusty catches a Caribbean cruise with his wife and child. It turns out that cruise was paid for by Adele, money that she had borrowed from her mother to pay for a divorce.
Rusty came back from his cruise, and I had him whisked off the plane by the airport police department. He was scared to death. I went to his house to talk to him, and he was about ready to burst. At that point, he confessed.
Rusty talked about how this plan to murder Stephen has been something that he and Adele had been talking about for months.
It turns out that neither one of them had the skill set for the job. But someone else did.
The words out of Rusty's mouth were, "All I know is Ronnie did it." That's when I realized there was another person involved.
As far as Adele is concerned, when you need a job done right, it's best to bring in a professional.
Rusty and Ronald Pryor had worked together in construction jobs years before. Rusty knew that Ronnie was someone who was willing to do anything for money.
Anything. Like kill Stephen Craven.
So Rusty called Ron out of the blue and say, "Hey, I got $1,000 for you to do a job. And when you complete it, you'll get $15,000. All the pieces were in place to kill Steve. It was just a matter of when they were going to do it.
And when Stephen told Adele he was making a last-minute trip up to New York before their family vacation, she knew it was now or never.
She, at that point, was so angry, disliked him so much, so thoroughly. It was an ember that boiled, inside of her. She couldn't spend another minute with Steve.
It has to happen today.
And it did.
Rusty parked his truck around back of the Cravens' home, and Rusty and Ronnie went into the basement. Rusty then went up those stairs and said hello to Steve and acted like everything was just fine.
Adele goes downstairs, and to lure Stephen down there, she said, "Honey, the ferret got loose," because her children had a pet ferret.
Honey, the ferret got loose.
A simple cue for a most vicious attack.
He unsuspectedly goes walking down the basement steps, and that's when Stephen turned around and Ronnie whacked him over the head with a crowbar.
Adele always did have a strong work ethic, and she was going to make sure this job was done to her satisfaction.
Adele noticed that Stephen was still breathing, so she pulled out a .38, handed it to Ron, and said, "You need to shoot him." So Ron fired one time and noticed that Stephen was still breathing. So Ron shot him 2 more times.
And with that, the task was complete.
Adele immediately left in her car, and she stayed away from the house for the remainder of the day. And Stephen was dead.
With Rusty in handcuffs and his confession on the record, there's just one final piece of this puzzle to place.
We were able to get a warrant for Ron's arrest and bring him back to the police department. I interviewed Ron, and he confessed to his part of the homicide.
In April 2002, Ronnie Pryor takes his chances with a jury and is found guilty. He is ultimately sentenced to life in prison without the chance of parole. To avoid the death penalty, Rusty cuts a deal with prosecutors. He agrees to testify against Adele in exchange for life in prison.
The jury was left with what Adele said and with what Rusty said. And Adele is a believable character because she preys upon people's emotions. She's excellent at manipulating people.
Despite a tough game of he said, she said, Adele Craven eventually folds and pleads guilty in February 2004. She is sentenced to life in prison and is eligible for parole in the year 2024.
I feel sorry for Stephen's family, especially Stephen's sons, who will never get to know him, won't be able to go fishing with him, to fly with him, to spend time with him. They will never know what a wonderful person Stephen would be.
What happened to Stephen is beyond reprehensible. Adele had him brutalized right in front of her so she could watch. She's the most brutal person that I could imagine. And I hope Adele thinks about it every day in jail.
If these stories teach us anything, it's that love can be one tough job. But while there are no shortcuts to a happy marriage, there are no easy outs from a bad one. So the next time you feel like lying down on the job, just be sure you sleep with one eye open.